When a person has entity attachments, that entity will affect their mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health in a variety of ways. The effects that the entity attachment has on the person is, of course, going to depend on the nature or category of the entity itself, and in situations where a witch or warlock has sent the entity to a person, how that entity affects that person is also going to depend on what the sorcerer has contracted or instructed the entity to do. So there are many ways to pick up an entity attachment. Spell work does not necessarily have to be involved. Hello, beautiful people. It is Oshun Kimi, your sage, your guru, your mystic, and your spiritual informant. And today I am coming to you with part 1 of a 3-part series on entity attachments. Today we'll delve into the topic of how to know when an entity is attached to us, or what are some signs that an entity is attached. And then in part 2, we'll discuss the various ways that a person can pick up an entity attachment. And in part 3, we'll discuss how to clear, cleanse, and get rid of entity attachments. And so please be sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you want to keep up with the powerful and mystical conversations that we have here on this channel. So in general, when someone has an entity attachment, they could feel that they suffer from psychological disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or borderline personality disorder, because it's important to understand that everything that has a psychological or a physical aspect is also going to have a spiritual aspect. So on a psychological aspect, these things are called schizophrenia and bipolar, but on a spiritual aspect, or from a spiritual point of view, it means that we are dealing with entity or spiritual attachments. Another major sign of having an entity attachment or a spiritual parasite of some sorts is experiencing limitations or blockages with your spiritual gifts. So there are many people I have met who will say that at some point in their journey, they were a lot more psychic or intuitive or had more communication with their guides than they do now. So when someone experiences limitations on spiritual gifts that they previously had a lot more access to, then that is very well a sign of a negative entity attachment, blocking your connection to source, to your God power, and to your divinity. Entity attachments feed off energy, and money is an energy. Currency is an energy. And so experiencing blockages to your money can also be a sign of having a negative entity attachment. So someone who has an entity attachment may feel a sense of doubleness, like they have two minds, one light and one dark, perhaps very dark. Because having an entity attachment can feel literally like having a devil on your shoulder. And this is because of the ways that negative entity attachments feed on and cause negative emotions, especially emotions like explosive anger or rage, jealousy, impatience, and other narcissistic tendencies like grandeur, self-centeredness, and having an unnecessary or unjustified level of self-importance. And this is why so many Christians associate the Jezebel spirit with narcissists and narcissism, because there is literally an archetypal spirit behind these types of negative emotions and behind various psychological disorders, right? So negative entity attachments can also affect a person's sex drive and their eating habits in extreme ways. So making a person extremely promiscuous and or extremely overindulgent when it comes to food, sex, and substances. And so when someone has an entity attachment, they could feel unusually hungry or have unusual cravings for things. Maybe they're craving more sweets, more fried food, or more red meat. All of that is going to be a sign of having negative entity attachments, because particular spirits of certain spiritual categories like those types of foods. So a lot of the times when we have cravings for things, we associate those cravings with things that we want. But actually the things that you are craving could very well be things that the entity attached to you wants to feed on. And so it's important to remember that when we are dealing with demoniac energies and negative entities, these spirits target the lower senses and urges. And so if your mind is always on food or sex or substances or partying, then that is a sign that you may have a negative entity attachment. And when we stay in those lower urges for extended periods of time, this leads us to attracting more and more entity attachments. So when someone has a negative entity attachment, they may find themselves very preoccupied with the senses, particularly what the body can feel and taste. So demonic entity attachments play on the lower senses and urges because their whole mission is to keep humans in a lowly, pretty much animalistic state, because a primary goal for them is to cut humans off from God consciousness. And so another sign of having a negative entity attachment is feeling like you are puppeteered, like someone else or something else is in control of your behaviors, your thoughts, and your decisions. So let's say you decide you want to go celibate or switch up your diet or finally break up with a person, but you can never actually stick with your decisions. Somewhere along the way, you give in again, and the urge to give back into what you said you would give up feels basically irresistible. That's a sign of being influenced by a negative entity when you cannot make decisions for yourself that you stick to, because before you know it, here comes that little voice that says you can't do that, or it's going to be too hard, or you don't have the power to do XYZ. And that's a sign of being influenced by a negative entity, because these entities know that if you were indeed to give up that thing that you know you need to release, it would not be able to have the same level of access to you. And so having negative entity attachments is essentially what it means to have a spiritual parasite. It's a process of having a spiritual double around you at all times, feeding on your life force and growing stronger every time you give into a lower nature urge when you know that you could do better. And that is the key here. Spirit only works according to our consciousness, right? And so there are some times where we actually don't know that we're not doing that well. We can only evolve according to our level of spiritual understanding. So when we don't know better, we can't necessarily do better. This is why we engage in spiritual study, so that we can learn better and we can do better. But this is also why when you don't do better and you know better, the spiritual consequences are heavier, because we are essentially giving our power away to something that we know we are stronger than or better than, or we know we need to do better in that regard. And so negative entity attachments essentially want to live through a person. And so there are things that they love to eat, watch, or do. And this is why discovering ourselves on a soul level is going to be so important, because a lot of the things that we think are our own interests, our own thoughts, and our own desires are actually that of an entity. So there could be physical symptoms of having a negative entity attachment as well. Back pain and stomach pain or issues is going to be especially common, because negative entity attachments usually will take root in the lower chakras, the sacral, the solar, and the root chakra. Frankly, they can also take root in any major organ, including a person's eyes. And so experiencing headaches and or brain fog is also a sign of having a negative entity attachment attached to the crown chakra. And so yes, entities can live in the gut. They can live in any major organ. They also very commonly, excuse my language, live in the anus because of all the waste that is there. So I'm going to go more into this topic in part 3 of how we get rid of entity attachments, right? So the number one place that a person will notice an entity attachment is going to be in the dream state. As I always say, dreaming of sex, kissing, intimacy, and eating is a number one sign of having a spiritual attachment. Also, dreaming of a lot of animals in your dreams, because I talked about how demonic entities and energies want to keep us in an animalistic state. There is what we call in the Ifa cosmology, or in Ifa understandings of things, the such thing as a vertical being and a horizontal being. And so a human can be either a vertical being or a horizontal being. And when we are in horizontal energy, that means that we are living in an animalistic ways. All we think about is what we're going to eat, drink, sleep, and poop. right? And then we have living in a vertical being where we are thinking more about our spirit, more about God, more about our connection to source, more about our spiritual powers and our spiritual energies. And so when you are dreaming of a lot of animals, especially things like dogs, you will be dealing with entities and spirits that want to keep you in a horizontal state of lowliness. And so anytime we're dreaming of things like dogs, reptilians, cats, and etc., these are signs of having particular entity attachments, or that there are spirits wanting and or watching and waiting for their moment to attach to you, because spirits will usually attach to us while we are sleeping in the dream state. Yes, I made a video about this already entitled How Sorcerers Manipulate Your Dreams and Your Emotions, right? And so I'm going to leave this video here for now because there are two more parts that I'm going to create to extend this conversation. In the meantime, if you need a reading to discover whether you may be experiencing an entity attachment, please feel free to schedule a one-on-one session with me. And if you'd like to get exclusive access to higher level mystical teachings, I highly recommend you joining the Patreon where all the real magic happens. I wish enlightenment and clarity upon every viewer of this video. Ashe.